Hello and welcome to the Village Chapel for our sixth Chronicle of Narnia, entitled The Last Battle. The story begins in the last days of Narnia, in the wild country, in the western part of Narnia. In this land lived an ape named Shift. He was very old, ugly, but also clever. And he lived with a donkey named Puzzle. They were best friends, except that Puzzle, because he was not intelligent and therefore easily led, was used by Shift, the ape, as a personal servant. Puzzle did all the work for Shift, while Shift convinced Puzzle that it was all to the donkey's advantage to do the work, while Shift did all the thinking. One day, they were at a nearby waterfall called the Cauldron Pool. And floating in the pool, they see a yellow object which Shift gets Puzzle to dive in and retrieve. It's a lion's skin with a head. Shift gets Puzzle to put it on when it's all dried out and pretend that he's Aslan. Then, and of course you remember Aslan is the Christ figure in all of these stories. Pretend that he's Aslan, then they could tell people in Narnia what to do, and they would have to obey because of their devotion to Aslan. Puzzle thinks Aslan would get mad, but Shift convinces him to let Shift do the thinking. The story then moves to the king of Narnia. His name is Tirian, who happens to be in the West Country at his hunting lodge. He's a young man between 20 and 25, and he is with his most loyal supporter and friend, a unicorn called Jewel. Then a centaur, and as you know, a centaur is half man on the top and a horse on the bottom. A centaur appears named Runewit, who informs them that, contrary to earlier reports, the omens say that Aslan is not due to come back to Narnia. They all agree that Aslan is not a tame lion, so he comes and he goes as he pleases. Then a wailing voice approaches them from the forest. It's a dryad. A dryad is a tree spirit in Greek mythology, who tells them that there are people cutting down trees without permission in the great western forest. Tirian is enraged and lets his anger get the best of him. Against the advice of Runewit, he tells the centaur to go back to the castle at Cair Paravel, that's the castle he lives in, and assemble an army. In the meantime, he and Jewel will go and investigate. Along the way, they meet a water rat on a raft going down a river, and he tells them it is the Calormenes who are cutting down the trees. And if you remember our last story about the horse and his boy, the Calormenes are meant to remind us of the Muslims in the world. It is the Calormenes who are cutting down the trees, and they are doing it under the authority of Aslan. Tirian is mystified by this. When they reach the scene of the woodcutting, they see Calormenes also using Narnians' talking horses to pull the timber. Tirian, as king, is just beside himself with anger. He and Jewel attack two Calormen who are abusing their horses, and they kill them. Talking to the horses afterwards, they are told that Aslan has ordered the animals to serve the Calormen. Feeling ashamed for his rash action and believing that Aslan, remember, he's not a tame lion, that Aslan might just be doing all this, Tyrion surrenders himself to the other Calormen, and they are taken to the highest point of a hill on which sits a little hut, like a stable, and in front of the stable sits an ape, and the ape is Shift. And the ape is dressed in the clothing of a dwarf, and he looks ridiculous. Around him are gathered a number of talking animals of Narnia, along with a small force of Calormen soldiers. Shift, in collusion with the Calormen, is passing himself off as the representative of Aslan, who is in the stable, supposedly. And much to the sadness of all the animals, he tells them, in the name of Aslan, they will have to be enslaved to the Calormens. When they ask to hear this directly from Aslan, Shift reminds them that Aslan is not a tame lion, which is true, and that he has appointed Shift as his spokesman, which is not true. When a lamb asks why Aslan would tell them to work for the Calormens, who worship Tash and who don't believe in Aslan, Shift tells them that Aslan and Tash are the same. In other words, we might think that Allah and God are the same. Do you believe that's true? Just different names for the same God. Allah and God. Tash is Aslan. Aslan is Tash. That's what Shift tells them. At this point, Tyrion can stand it no longer. He tells the ape that he's a liar. Shift commands the Calormens to take Tyrion to a tree and tie him up. Jewel is tied up at the stable. During the night, some loyal mice arrive to gnaw the king free from the rope, and they tell the king that everyone believes Aslan has returned to Narnia, is mad at them, and thus is punishing them by making them slaves of the Calormen. In desperation, Tyrion calls upon Aslan for help, offering his own death if only Aslan will save Narnia. Tyrion is then plunged into a dream in which he sees Peter, Lucy, Edmund, Eustace, and Jill, all characters in previous Chronicles, sitting at a table in England. And they see him as well. And Peter charges him to speak. Then the vision fades. The next thing Tyrion knows, he sees before him a young boy and girl, Eustace and Jill from the Silver Chair, who have been transported to Narnia to help him. They untie the ropes and they tell Tyrion how they got there. They were both riding on a train to meet Peter, Edmund, and Lucy, and just as the train reached the station, there was a horrible wreck. And presto, they were in Narnia. Tyrion leads them to a tower battlement where they get supplies and spend the night. The next day, they decide to return to the stable hill to rescue Jewel, the unicorn, which they do. But Jill, on her own initiative, goes into the stable and brings out Puzzle, the donkey in a lion's skin. He satisfies them that he's been just a pawn in the conspiracy between Shift, the ape, and the Calormens. After they rescue Jewel, they decide to go back to the tower to regroup and plan their strategy. The plan is to confront the ape and the talking animals with Puzzle and show that the false Aslan has been used to manipulate them. On the way, they meet a large group of dwarfs who are off to Calormen to work in the mines there, led by 2 Calormen soldiers. Tyrion and Eustace kill the soldiers, but then they're amazed that the dwarfs aren't grateful. They've become disillusioned about religion in general. They know that Tash is a fraud, a false god. But now they believe Aslan is a fraud as well. They decide that their salvation is in themselves. And they won't believe what are lies by either side. Now, Tyrion is really depressed, and they go on. But one loyal dwarf, runs after them. His name is Poggin. He swears loyalty to the king, Aslan. They go back to the tower to eat and sleep, and then they set out for the stable again to confront the Calormens and the ape. Along the way, they meet a loyal eagle who tells them that he's been to Caer Paravel, the castle of the king, and that all the Narnians, the centaur, and the force he was to assemble, they've all been killed by a Calormen army that had arrived by sea. Tyrion now believes that Narnia is dead as a country. They now realize that Shift, the ape, has conspired with the Calormens for the takeover of Narnia. But there is nothing to do but to attack the enemy and either prevail or die valiantly. As they journey to the stable, Jill and Eustace talk about the prospect of dying and what it would be like. And they conclude that dying in battle on the side of Aslan is better than dying in bed in London at the age of 80, or dying in a railway accident. Hold that thought. They arrive at the stable at night. There's a big bonfire in front of it. The talking animals are demanding that Aslan come out of the stable. But Shift, who knows Puzzle has escaped, he's not there anymore, now says that a false Aslan, a donkey in a lion's skin, is masquerading as Aslan and should be killed if found. But the real Aslan is in the stable. The animals don't believe this, especially the rebellious dwarfs. So they demand to see Aslan. The ape appears shaken by this because he knows that Aslan isn't really in the stable, but he has been hidden in the stable. But he has hidden in the stable a Calormen soldier to kill with his sword anyone who enters. So he suggests to the talking animals, if any is brave enough to look Aslan in the face, to go into the stable. A talking cat goes in and comes running out, unable to talk. This terrified the talking animals. Then a young Calormen soldier comes forward bravely. He offers to enter into the stable. Believing, as was told him, that Aslan is the same as Tash, who is the god he worships. So he goes into the stable, and soon a dead body of a Calorman is thrown out of the door. But it's not that young man, whose name we find out is Emeth. At this point, Tyrion, who's been hiding in the shadows with the others, has had enough. He orders his force to draw swords, and they rush forward from the shadows to the front of the stable. When they do this, the Calormans, taken by surprise, retreat and regroup. Tyrion throws Shift, the ape, into the stable and then calls upon the talking animals to come fight for Narnia. Some of them do, but most of them don't. But then, in the distance, they see a large herd of talking horses running to their aid. But then they see the dwarfs shooting them down with arrows. The dwarfs shout that they're not on anyone's side. The dwarfs are for the dwarfs. Tyrion and his group flee to a large rock away from the stable to make a last stand. The Calormenes have beat their drums, and hundreds of Calormenes begin to arrive at the battle scene. Tyrion and the others believe that all is lost. They've fought bravely, but this is their last day to be alive in Narnia. Each of them is then killed. Eustace, Jill, Jewel, the unicorn, Poggin, the dwarf, until, as the last one alive, Tyrion is backed into the stable. Inside, he sees something miraculous. He sees an enormous, beautiful country inside, and he sees Peter, Edmund, and Lucy there. Then Peter, Edmund, and Lucy describe what happened to them just before Jill and Eustace arrived at the train station. They're all about to die and then transported back to Narnia to see the end. Then Tyrion observed how large the stable is on the inside, with all its fields and orchards. Then Lucy tells Tyrion how, while waiting in the stable, they saw a young Calorman come in and kill another Calorman, and then he went off, asking for Tash. Then a bunch of dwarfs came in the stable, and they all went off by themselves away from everyone else. Then Aslan called all of his creation home. The animals, even the stars, fell from the sky, all came up to him for the final judgment. Then they saw the young Calorman soldier, and he told them his story. Then the children realized that this was the end of Narnia, and they couldn't come back again, and they'd have to go back to England, or so they thought. Aslan said to Lucy, "You do not look so happy as I mean you to be." Lucy said, "We're so afraid of being sent away, Aslan, and you have sent us back into our own world so often." "No fear of that," said Aslan. "Have you not guessed?" Their hearts leaped, and a wild hope rose within them. There was a real railway accident, said Aslan softly. Your father and your mother and all of you are, as you used to call it in the Shadowlands, dead. The term is over. The holidays have begun. The dream is ended. This is the morning. And as he spoke, he no longer looked to them like a lion. But the things that began to happen after that were so great and so beautiful that I cannot write them down. And for us, this is the end of all the stories. And we can most truly say that they all lived happily ever after. But for them, it was only the beginning of the real story. All their life in this world and all their adventures in Narnia had only been the cover and the title page. Now, at last, they were beginning chapter 1 of the great story, which no one on earth has ever read, which goes on forever, in which every chapter is better than the one before. Thanks so much for listening, and we'll finish next week with The Magician's Nephew.